The Great Pyramid of Giza is aligned with the cardinal directions. It's within a fraction of a degree. This video looks at 20 different ways ancient surveyors measured landscapes. They did it with extreme precision. They used simple tools. They used brilliant observation. By the end, you'll see the hidden ingenuity that built our world. Roman roads, mountain temples. How did rope and water create perfect geometry? Why were stars considered more reliable than maps? In a time before satellites, what does it mean to measure the Earth? Before the digital world, before satellites, even before the compass was common, there was a basic problem. How do you divide a field fairly after the flood? How do you make sure a temple's foundation lasts centuries? How do you lay out a city for thousands, with water and roads that work, using only what you can see and touch and reason through? This wasn't just an engineering problem. It was the foundation of civilization itself. From Mesopotamia to the Andes, measurement was a sacred trust. It was held by people who were part priest, part astronomer, part builder. Their precision wasn't for show. It was about social harmony, economic survival, spiritual duty. A crooked boundary could start a conflict. A misaligned canal could mean famine. A temple built askew from the stars was an offense to the gods. That deep cultural need, that mix of the practical and the cosmic, that's where we start. It turns their tools from curiosities into elegant answers to the most urgent questions a society could face. They stopped looking for a perfect ruler. They started listening to the world. The ancient surveyors' big insight was that nature gave them a perfect toolkit. The sun didn't rise in a random spot. The North Star stayed put all night every season. A still pool of water always found a level. It was always perfect. These weren't just things they saw. They were revelations. The world was chaotic, weather, politics, human error, but underneath it were these beautiful, dependable rules. So they built their entire art on these constants. A measurement was only as good as its reference point, and they chose references written in the sky, etched into the earth itself. That shift in thinking, from human standards to cosmic ones, that was everything. It meant a surveyor in Egypt and a planner in Mesopotamia. They were reading from the same celestial script. They'd never meet, but they were using the same language. It meant a boundary stone laid by a father could be found by his grandson 100 years later, because the same stars would be there watching. Their precision didn't come from complex machinery. It came from profound simplicity. They asked the universe for its benchmarks, and then they had the humility to use them. That philosophy, it transformed measurement. It went from a local craft to a universal language, a language that could whisper across mountains, across centuries with perfect clarity. The Roman surveyor, the agrimensor, would stand out on a plain. In a new territory, he had this tool, the Groma, a vertical staff with a cross at the top that could rotate, and from each arm of the cross a plumb line hung down. A thread with a weight. It looked simple, but when he looked past those hanging lines, aligning one with the next, he was drawing straight lines, invisible lines. Right angles across miles of land. That was the start of centuriation, the Roman system for dividing the world into squares. They began with two main lines. The Cardo, north-south, and the Decumanus, east-west, using the Groma to make sure they met at a perfect right angle that created the central crossroads. For a new settlement, then they repeated it, sighting along the plumb lines, marking parallel lines in both directions, creating a grid of squares. Each square was a centuria. Typically 710 meters on a side. That unit of land gave the system its name. Each square was subdivided, for veterans to farm, for public spaces. For the roads, the genius was in the repeatability, the scale. A single team with a Groma could lay out an entire colony, turn chaos into a predictable landscape. The straight Roman roads we still follow, property boundaries in European fields, the layout of cities from Britain to North Africa, they often come from that cross-shaped tool. From the surveyor turning it against the horizon, it was geometry as a tool of empire, but also a promise of stability, of fair division, a rational world measured out one right angle at a time. The Roman grid was about controlling space. For the Egyptians, the problem was sacred. How do you lay that first line, the first stone of a pyramid, so it faces true north? So it aligns with the stars. Their answer wasn't a cross of wood and string. It was a length of rope. They were the harpodonopti, the rope stretchers. Their tool was a loop of cord knotted at precise, equal intervals. You have a rope marked into 12 segments. 3 people hold it taut. 1 holds the knot at the start. A second holds the knot 3 segments down. A third takes the knot 7 segments from the start, which leaves 5 segments running back to the beginning. When they pull it tight, they're not just holding a line, they're forming a triangle, sides of 3 units, 4 units, and 5 units, and in that arrangement, a miracle appears. The angle between the 3-unit side and the 4-unit side is a perfect right angle. This was the 3-4-5 triangle, centuries before Pythagoras gave it a theorem. The rope stretchers used this right angle to establish a baseline, a foundation line oriented east-west, maybe by watching the sun's shadow at the equinox. Then, with their knotted rope, they could step off a perfect perpendicular line running north-south. That was the sacred axis, the line a pharaoh's eternal house would rise on. It seems too simple to be the secret behind the Great Pyramid's alignment, but that's the elegance of it. They took a principle written into mathematics and made it physical. Tangible, something a team could enact on the ground under the sun with a tool you could coil and carry in a bag. This wasn't abstract knowledge locked in a temple. It was working knowledge sung into the landscape with chance and tension. Every time they stretched that rope, they were invoking a cosmic truth, proving order could be summoned from chaos. That a line drawn in the sand, guided by this rule, could point toward the heavens. The pyramids stand for many things, but one of the most overlooked is the humble, knotted rope. And the quiet certainty of the people who knew how to listen to what its geometry was saying. A right angle is one thing, but if you're building a canal for hundreds of miles or a wall that has to run straight over hills, you face a different problem. You have to find level, not just a flat spot, but a continuous horizontal plane across the whole landscape. In ancient China, the engineers on the Grand Canal had this challenge. They needed to move water for thousands of li across plains and slopes. The flow had to be perfect, a drop so slight you could barely see it, but enough to keep the water moving from the source to the cities. Too steep and the current erodes the banks, too flat and the water just sits there, stagnant. Their solution came from watching 2 simple things work together. The first was the jiaoliang, a sighting tube, a long cylinder, bamboo or bronze. You look through it to block everything else out, to aim at a distant marker. Not at stars, at a colleague holding a tall, marked staff on the next hill. You align the tube and you have a line of sight, but that line isn't necessarily level. You could be looking up or down a slope, which is where the second principle comes in, the one that defines horizontal. Water finds its own level. They knew this as a visible fact. They'd dig a long, shallow trench along the proposed canal route, then fill it with water. By looking at the water's surface at different points, they could see exactly where the land rose and fell. They could mark where to cut or fill to create that perfect, gentle slope. The sighting tube gave them alignment over distance. The water trench gave them the true horizontal reference. Together, it was a surveying system of huge scale. Teams could work miles apart and know they were building a single, seamless grade. The Grand Canal, linking north and south for centuries, comes from this method. It was more than digging. It was a conversation with the landscape through water and light. The goal wasn't to conquer the terrain, but to persuade water to flow across it. Patiently for generations, a gentle slope across open land is one kind of problem, but then the landscape itself becomes the obstacle. You need to dig a tunnel straight through a mountain from two sides and have the teams meet in the middle in perfect alignment. Or you build an aqueduct that carries water for hundreds of miles, not just across valleys, but over them, on arches that have to rise and fall at exact, calculated grades. For these tasks, the Greeks introduced a new kind of vision. They built the Dioptra. Think of it as an eye, a mechanical eye that could quantify what the human eye could only estimate. Its core was a sighting tube like the Chinese Jiaoliang, but mounted on a calibrated circular plate. This plate could rotate a full circle horizontally, and it could tilt up and down. Around its edge were precise markings, degrees or fractions. When a Greek engineer like Hero of Alexandria looked through that tube and lined up a distant target, a marker on a far hillside, a star at a specific hour, he could then read the exact angle. Horizontal angle for direction, vertical angle for height or slope. That changed everything. Before, you could make a right angle or find a level. Now you could capture any angle. You could map the world not just in straight lines and squares, but in triangles. This is triangulation. You stand at a known point, measure the angle to a distant, inaccessible peak. You walk a measured distance along a baseline and measure the angle again. Now you have a triangle where you know one side and two angles. The geometry solves itself. It gives you the exact distance to that peak without ever setting foot on it. This is how you chart a coastline, how you map an empire, or plan the path of an aqueduct across impossible terrain. Hero of Alexandria described using the Dioptra to tunnel through a mountain. Teams started digging from opposite sides. Each used the instrument to sight on fixed markers far behind them, ensuring their tunnel stayed on a perfectly straight, predetermined line. They used plumb lines and water levels for grade. The precision required was staggering. A small error at the start would magnify over hundreds of feet of digging in the dark. But when the tunnels met, the alignment was near perfect. That meeting in the dark wasn't luck. It was the Dioptra's mathematics made physical. And for the aqueducts, those soaring stone rivers, the Dioptra provided the constant check. It measured the vital, gradual slope, often just a finger's width drop for every 100 feet of length that kept the water flowing. It ensured that every arch, every pier was placed not by guesswork, but by calculated necessity. The Dioptra transformed surveying. It went from a craft of lines and levels into a science of spatial relationships. It directly linked the geometry of the earth with the mathematics of the heavens. It proved that the same principles that ordered the stars could also guide a chisel through solid rock. It was the moment measurement learned to see in 3 dimensions. Geometry and machinery don't tell the whole story. In Mesopotamia, a boundary wasn't just a line on the ground. It was a covenant, and it was witnessed by the gods. When a king gave land to an official or a temple, they made it permanent with a Kudurru, a stone, usually dark basalt, carved with symbols and text. It listed the details of the grant, the property lines. And then it had something else, a series of divine emblems, the crescent moon for Sin, the star for Ishtar, the solar disk for Shamash. These weren't just decoration. They were celestial signatures. The boundary itself was often set by aligning its corners with specific events in the sky. A surveyor might wait for the evening when Venus, Ishtar's star, set right behind a distant mountain peak, seen from a certain corner post. Or they'd mark where the sun rose on the spring equinox relative to a rock formation. That alignment became part of the legal record. It was written into the stone. So years later, if there was a dispute, if floods had washed the markers away, you didn't just consult the stone. You looked at the sky. You waited for that same celestial event. And if the mountain peak still framed the setting planet from that remembered spot, the boundary was confirmed. The heavens were the notary. This practice tied time and space together. It meant property law ran on a cosmic clock. A boundary was valid not because a king declared it one day, but because the stars would affirm it every year forever. It lifted measurement from a physical act to a sacred one. The Kudurru stone was a tangible anchor, but its real authority came from the unchanging cycles above. This was precision with a deep purpose. It guaranteed fairness across generations. It connected a family's livelihood, their piece of earth, to the eternal rhythms of the cosmos. In Mesopotamia, to measure land was to inscribe human order into the celestial ledger. They had no writing, so how do you map an empire of mountains? They had an answer. It redefined what a map could be. They started from their capital, Cusco. They called it the navel of the world, and from its central temple, the Coricancha, they drew lines. Invisible lines, these were the Ceques, hundreds of them, radiating outward like spokes from a hub. Each line was a conceptual thread, not a road. It connected a sequence of sacred places. Huacas, a spring, an unusual rock, a hilltop, these were the markers. For them, the landscape was alive, charged with meaning, and the Ceques system was how they read it. It was a calendar. Different huacas corresponded to specific days, for rituals, for offerings. It was a social register. It organized labor. It organized tribute owed by different clans. And it was a geographic framework, an administrative one. The lines divided the empire into wedges, like slices of a pie. Each wedge radiated from Cusco deep into the provinces. Maintaining these divisions across the Andes required a surveyor's eye. They built aligned stone pillars on ridges. They used sight lines across valleys. A person standing at one huaca could see the next, and the next, a chain of visual confirmation across impossible terrain. This wasn't about measuring feet and inches. It was about relationships. Your village place was defined by which Ceques line you were on, which huacas you were responsible for, your water rights. Your festival duties, your identity, all anchored to this invisible radial grid. The Ceques system transformed a vertical world, made it manageable, made it spiritually coherent. It proved measurement could be a story, not written on parchment, written across the living earth, a story of connection, of memory, of sacred duty, held in place by sight lines to a distant stone. The sky could hide the sun for months. In the far north, the Viking world was all low sun and long twilight and constant cloud. The stars might be invisible. The sun just a glow behind a gray blanket. Navigating the open sea under that was one thing, but to lay out a farmstead or a longhouse or a property line with any precision on land seemed impossible. They did it anyway. Their secret might have been a stone, not a tool you hold up to measure an angle, but one you hold up to read the light, the sunstone. A crystal of cordierite or calcite. On a clear day, it's just a translucent rock, but on an overcast day, when the sun is a hidden bright patch in the haze, something happens. Light from the sun, even when scattered by clouds, keeps a subtle pattern of polarization. Its waves vibrate in a specific direction relative to the sun's position. The human eye can't see this, but the right crystal can. You look through a sunstone and rotate it slowly. A trained observer would see a change in brightness or color inside the crystal. At a certain orientation, the crystal would appear darkest or clearest. That reveals the hidden polarization axis, and that axis points directly to the sun, even if the sun is completely obscured. With that single reference point, you have your east-west line, you have your orientation. On a longship, this meant survival. On land, for a settler in Iceland or Greenland, it meant order. It meant you could align the main axis of your longhouse to face the morning sun for warmth, even on the day you laid the foundation posts in a fog. It meant boundary markers between farms could be set along a true line, not a guess. That prevented future disputes over encroachment. This wasn't geometry with ropes or calibrated circles. This was applied mineralogy, an intuitive hack of physics. They learned to ask the light a question, and the crystal gave them the answer. It turned the entire sky, even a gray one, into a compass. The Sunstone represents a different kind of precision. One born from deep observation of material properties in a specific, brutal environment. It wasn't about conquering the landscape with measurement, but listening to it more closely. Finding direction not in the grand movements of stars, but in the hidden signature of light within a simple stone. The Sunstone could give direction from a hidden sun. But if your world is only ocean, there are no landmarks. The horizon is just the curve of the earth. For the Polynesian navigators, the sea wasn't an empty space. It was a detailed map written in the stars and the water. Their precision wasn't about dividing land. It was about finding the smallest specks of land in all that blue. They built a mental surveying system of staggering accuracy, using only memory and observation. They started with the stars, not as general guides but as precise highways. They memorized star paths. They knew specific stars would rise and set at fixed points on the horizon like gateposts. As you sail, those points shift. A master navigator lying in the hull of his canoe would track these shifts. If the star Hopewell rose exactly off the bow night after night, he knew he was on the correct latitude line. Sailing east, if it began to rise slightly to the left or right, he was drifting north or south. This was celestial navigation refined to an art of memory. They had a mental star compass, the 360-degree horizon divided into dozens of named houses, each with its own guiding star. They weren't just sailing toward an island. They were sailing down a star corridor, staying within its invisible walls. But stars can be obscured by clouds, so they had a second map, even more subtle. The ocean swells, great, deep ocean waves from consistent trade winds and distant storms. These swells march across the Pacific in steady, predictable patterns. And when an island lies in their path, something happens. The swells refract, they bend around the mass of land. They also create a sheltered, comma zone downwind of the island. A navigator learned to feel these patterns with his entire body. Lying down in the canoe, he could sense the dominant swell rhythm through the vessel's motion. A slight, persistent shift in that rhythm, a new cross swell, a patch of confused water that could tell him an island was near long before any tree or bird appeared. He could even judge its direction and approximate size. This was wave piloting, reading the ocean's own topography, its submerged footprints of land. And when they found an island, these principles didn't stop at the shore. They translated them onto the land itself. Paths between villages might be aligned with the star path used to reach that island. A sacred mare, a temple platform, might be oriented so its altar faced the point where a crucial navigational star rose. The direction of the dominant ocean swell, the pathway that brought life to the island, might be mirrored in the layout of a chief's house or the community's fishing grounds. The entire landscape became an extension of the navigational map, a reminder, a teaching tool for the next generation. This was a system of extreme precision built entirely on environmental literacy and oral tradition. No written charts, no instruments, just generations of accumulated knowledge passed down in chants and stories and direct experience. It proved that measurement at its highest level is a form of profound attention. Learning to hear the whispers of the world, the bend of a wave, the steadfast arc of a star, and to trust they are telling you exactly where you are, the Pacific was not a barrier. It was a known and named place, every current and constellation a signpost. In the greatest act of mental surveying the world has ever seen, a straight line over hills doesn't work for water. The genius was in the slope, a river of stone carrying water for hundreds of miles, from a spring in the mountains to the heart of the city. The real challenge was invisible. The gradient had to be perfect, just enough fall so the water would move by gravity. A drop so slight you could walk 100 feet beside it and not see it. But if the slope was too steep, the water would rush. It would erode the stone, burst the seals, too shallow, and the water would stagnate, a lifeless canal. For Rome, this was the difference between a healthy city and one plagued by thirst, by illness. Their answer was a tool of quiet brilliance, the Chorobates. A wooden bench 20 feet long, along the top a shallow groove carved perfectly straight. At the start of the day, the crew would fill that groove with water. Then they waited for the water to become perfectly still. Its surface, by nature's law, would find a true level. Now, attached to each end of the bench were vertical boards. With precise sighting lines etched into them, the surveyor would crouch behind one end, peer over the still water in the groove, align those sighting marks with a distant target, a tall staff held by an assistant maybe a mile away. If the line of sight matched the plane of the water's surface, they had a true horizontal. Any tilt of the bench would be betrayed by the water, a calibration tool built by nature itself. With that confirmed horizontal they could measure. They'd drive a stake into the ground at the Chorobates' location, mark its exact height. Then the team would move forward, carrying that heavy bench, and repeat the process. Stake after stake, mile after mile, a chain of known elevations across the landscape. By comparing the height of these stakes over the measured distance between them, they could calculate the gradient. With astonishing accuracy, historical accounts say they could achieve slopes as gentle as 1 part in 10,000. So for every 10,000 feet the aqueduct traveled, it would drop only 1 foot. A gradient the human eye could never see, but water would follow. The Chorobates was more than an instrument. It was a philosophy made of wood and water. It acknowledged that human senses were flawed, but that nature provided a perfect reference. You didn't need to trust the carpenter's eye or the mason's spirit. You trusted the water. This humble bench was the silent guardian of Rome's public health. It ensured that the aqua pia, the aqua marcia, all those arches marching across the land, delivered not just water but a reliable flow. Clean, life-giving, it turned the simple observation that water finds its level into the foundation for an empire's hygiene. For its growth, the Chorobates measured nothing more than stillness. But that stillness built rivers in the sky. The altar had to be perfect. The ritual would fail otherwise. That was the force behind this tradition in ancient India. The Vedic texts, some of the oldest sacred writings, they have these incredibly detailed instructions for building fire altars. They called them Agni. And these weren't simple pits. They were complex geometric constructions, precise shapes laid out on the ground, squares, circles, rectangles, even bird-shaped platforms. All with specific, mandated areas. The ritual's power depended on exactness, so the priests who built them became, by necessity, master surveyors. Their toolkit was familiar. Cords for lines, pegs for markers, but their starting point was human. They derived their standard unit, the angular, from the width of a finger, not just any finger. The finger of the patron of the sacrifice. That created a personal yet standardized scale. 12 angulars made a vitesti, the span of a hand. 24 vitesti made a hasta, a cubit. This system, rooted in the body, was then used to define something cosmic. The altar's area had to match a prescribed number of square units, often numbers from Vedic cosmology. Laying out a perfect square altar of a given area meant solving geometric problems. They knew, for instance, how to construct a square with an area equal to the sum of 2 other squares. That's the Pythagorean theorem in practice. Centuries before the Greek philosopher gave it his name, they'd stretch chords diagonally, use them to transform rectangles into squares. Ensuring the final construction held the correct sacred measure, the texts even describe using a circular rope to find the east-west line by marking the shadows of a central gnomon. Mark them in the morning and evening, then bisect the angle. That was astronomy serving ritual. The consequence of this sacred demand was a rigorous, preserved, advanced body of practical geometry. The need for ritual efficacy enforced a culture of extreme precision. A mistake wasn't just a technical error, it was a spiritual failure that ensured the knowledge was passed down. How to measure, how to derive units, how to solve for area and shape, passed down with meticulous care from teacher to student, generation after generation. The fire altar was a temporary structure of earth and brick, but the geometric principles it embodied became permanent. They moved from the ritual ground to the fields, to the foundations of early cities. What began as an act of devotion became a cornerstone of practical science. It showed that sometimes the most enduring advances in measurement, they come not from a need to conquer, but from a desire to connect, to get the sacred geometry exactly right, so the universe might listen. A sacred altar needs perfect form, but a city needs water. In Persia, in the desert, that was the whole problem. You could see the mountains far off with snow, water up there, but between here and there, miles of plain. Sun, heat, any open ditch would just vanish, so they hid the river, they buried it, they built the Qanat, a tunnel, a gentle slope underground. It would start at a mountain spring, an aquifer, and just let gravity pull the water down. All the way to a city, to an oasis. The idea is simple. The doing of it, that was the hidden work, the surveying. They'd begin where they wanted the water to come out. The mother well, then they'd work backwards toward the mountain. They'd dig a line of shafts straight down every 50, 100 paces. These shafts, they were for air, for getting the dirt out, but their real purpose was for sighting, for the survey. From the top of a new shaft, the engineers had to figure the direction and the slope, the exact downward slope for the tunnel. They used simple things, a long pole marked, lowered into the last shaft to get a height, a basin of water still to find true level. By sighting from one shaft to the next, they could work out the drop. The gradient was everything. Too steep, the water rushes. It eats the tunnel walls, collapses everything. Too shallow, the water just sits. It goes bad. They needed a slope so consistent, so slight, sometimes less than a meter down for a whole kilometer forward. You couldn't feel it walking in the tunnel for miles in the dark. The diggers, they worked from both ends of a shaft section. They had to meet in the middle. With that exact grade, they used oil lamps. They listened for the sound of the other's pick. When the tunnels connected, the alignment had to be perfect. The slope perfect. A mistake meant a dead end or a pool of stagnant water. The Qanat was like a city underground. Its vertical shafts were like skylights. Along a buried street, some Qanats went for 50 kilometers. Thousands of these shafts. They turned dead land into gardens. They held up empires. This was surveying, but deeper. It wasn't about marking lines under the sky. It was about putting a perfect, invisible geometry into the Earth's own hidden body, trusting math you couldn't see. To guide a pick in the dark, to bring life up to the surface, the Qanat didn't fight the desert. It whispered, and the desert gave up its water. The Qanat was a river of life, but it was hidden in the earth. For the Maya, the entire city was a map of the heavens. They built Tikal, Chichen Itza, Palenque. In the Mesoamerican jungle, these weren't just places to live. They were living calendars. A temple wasn't just a building. It was a marker for when the sun stood directly overhead and cast no shadow. A ball court's long axis might point to the rising sun on a solstice. A pyramid staircase could be designed so that on the equinox, the setting sun would create a serpent of light slithering down the steps. These weren't accidents. They were the result of generations, surveyors reading the sky and then inscribing its movements onto the landscape with stone. The process began with observation. Priests and calendar keepers would track the sun's path for years. They noted where it rose and set on the horizon on key dates. They followed Venus. They saw it as a god of war. They charted its complex cycle, appearing as a morning star, then an evening star. They knew these cycles. Then the next step was translation. How do you take a celestial event, a point on the horizon, and make it permanent in a city of stone? They used long sight lines. A surveyor might stand at a central point, a platform maybe, and sight across the top of a distant temple. He'd line it up with a notch between two hills on the horizon. That notch was where the sun rose on the summer solstice. They would place a stone marker along that line. Then another, creating a permanent, immovable line of sight, one you could check year after year. Over generations, they built major structures along these lines. The pyramid goes here because from its summit you see Venus set directly over that temple. The main causeway runs this way because it points to the sunrise on the day the rains should begin. This turned the city into a cosmogram, a model of the universe. Walking down a broad avenue was like walking through time. The architecture itself told you the season, what ceremony was due, when to plant, when to harvest. The precision required was immense. They were measuring angles over distances of miles, through uneven, forested terrain. A small error in alignment at the founding of a city would compound over centuries of construction. Yet the alignments hold to this day. At Chichen Itza, the Pyramid of El Castillo has 91 steps on each of its 4 sides. That's 364. Plus the platform on top makes 365, a solar year, and on the equinoxes, the play of light and shadow creates the illusion, a feathered serpent descending the staircase. This was more than a spectacle. It was a public demonstration, undeniable, that the rulers and priests were in harmony with the cosmos, that their authority was written in the stars, confirmed by the sun. This shows a civilization that didn't separate time from space, or the sacred from the practical. Measuring the land was the same act as measuring the year. A straight line between 2 temples was also a countdown to a holy day. By building their world as a reflection of the sky, they made the cosmic order tangible. You could see it, walk it, live inside it. The city became a clock, a calendar, and a covenant all in one. It was a way of ensuring human life moved in a perfect, observable rhythm with the forces that sustained it. The jungle has reclaimed many of their plazas, but the stone still remembers the sun's path, and on the right day, at the right hour, the ancient alignment speaks again. A beam of light finds its target across centuries, proving their measure of the world was meant to last. A city of stone says something about permanence. But for the daily work of running a kingdom, you need something else, something less cosmic but just as important. You need to know who owns what land and who owes what tax. After the Normans took England, the new king wanted exactly that, a final record, every piece of land, every field, every mill, every pig. For tax, for control, they called it the Domesday Book. A survey so complete, they said no one could hide from it. But that huge book started with a simple, physical thing. A man walking a field with a chain, not a sacred rope, a chain of a set length. They called it a perch or a rod, 16.5 feet. It was a blunt tool of authority. Teams would walk the edges of a manor, laying this iron chain down, end to end, counting the lengths. They'd use a simple cross staff to check the corners. It was slow, methodical work, mud on the boots, the sound of metal links, calling numbers to a scribe. This was measurement without any ceremony. It was about accountability. The perch was defined by law, the same in Yorkshire as in Cornwall. That consistency turned local custom into a royal fact. A farmer's traditional strip could now be described as so many perches by so many perches. Its value could be calculated, its tax could be set. The Domesday Book is this marvel of administrative ambition, but its truth came from those chains in the mud. From repeating a standard unit over and over across a conquered land. That system of perches and chains became the backbone of English land law for centuries. It showed that precision isn't always about the stars. Sometimes it's about making a common language, a language so simple, so repeatable, it can settle arguments, fill a treasury, map the whole economy of a nation. The great cathedrals of that time point upward, but the surveyor's chain measured the ground that paid for them. It was the unglamorous machinery of power. Turning soil into data, one standard link at a time. The chain measured the earth for a ledger, but to measure the shape of a kingdom, to put its mountains and rivers on a single page, you needed something else. You needed a tool that thought in triangles. You needed the astrolabe. We know it from ships, from finding latitude by the stars. But for a medieval scholar, that same brass disc was a surveyor's instrument. It was a model of the sky, a rotating star chart. Turn it on its side and it measured angles. A surveyor would hold it by a ring, let it hang. He'd sight through the alidade, a ruler on the front, lining it up with a distant mountain peak or a castle tower. On the scale around the edge, he'd read the angle of elevation. That number was a key. He'd move to a new position, a measured distance away, take a second angle to the same landmark. Now he had a triangle. He knew the length of the base, the distance between his 2 points, and he knew the 2 angles at each end. The rules of trigonometry from scholars like Al-Biruni could solve the rest. They could calculate the exact distance to that mountain, or its height. This was triangulation made portable. It allowed for regional maps with a consistency that wasn't possible before. A team could build a web of triangles across a landscape, each measurement reinforcing the next, turning hills and valleys into a network of coordinates. This wasn't just curiosity, it was for planning, to map the course of a new irrigation canal, knowing exactly how the land fell, to divide agricultural plots in a new valley, to define borders with mathematical certainty, to reduce disputes. The astrolabe's genius was translation. It took the language of the cosmos, the measured arcs between stars, and applied that same grammar to the earth. It proved the distance to a star and the height of a hill used the same principles, the same tool. A scholar in a Baghdad observatory and a land agent in a Spanish field were conducting the same experiment. One looked up to chart the universe, the other looked out to chart a domain. Both used the astrolabe to turn observation into knowledge, an angle into a fact. The tool became a bridge. It connected celestial mechanics to the needs of administration and agriculture. Mastering the sky was about understanding your own place on the ground. With a clarity that wasn't there before, the astrolabe turned the sky into coordinates, but to write a message directly on the earth, a message you could only read from above. That's what happened in the river valleys here. The Hopewell and others, they sculpted the land into these monumental shapes, serpents that curve for a quarter mile. Bears with paws outstretched, perfect circles, octagons, hundreds of feet across. These are the effigy mounds. Building them was an act of surveying. On a breathtaking scale, so you have a design, a sacred bird maybe. You start with a small model, outlined with twigs on cleared ground. Every curve has meaning. Then you enlarge it 100 times onto a hillside, across gullies, through trees, and the proportions have to hold. They'd begin with a central axis. Aligned to a solar event or lunar, they used long cords knotted at intervals like giant measuring tapes, tall stakes to mark key points, the tip of a wing. The curve of a tail from a central platform. A surveyor would sight along these stakes, directing teams to move markers left or right until the line of sight matched the intended curve. Maintaining level was a constant battle on uneven ground. They might have used water-filled trenches to find a horizontal plane across a slope, so one wing didn't sag compared to the other. This was geometry made communal. It required coordinated labor, many people trusting the plan held by a few. The result transformed the landscape into a permanent text. A bear mound wasn't just a bear, it was a statement of identity, a map of clan relationships, a prayer made visible. Walking the path of the serpent might have been a ceremonial journey. Retelling a creation story with every step, the precision served a symbolic purpose, a perfect circle connected to the cycles of the sun and moon. The exact orientation of a long mound might point to a significant place on the horizon. This was measurement in the service of memory and meaning. It proved precision could have a spiritual vocabulary. You could use chords and stakes not just to claim territory, but to inscribe a culture's deepest beliefs into the very skin of the world. The mounds are quiet now, covered in grass and trees, but their shapes endure. A testament to a vision so grand it needed the whole earth as its canvas. The earth became a sacred text, but to write it, you need a true line. For the Egyptians, the most important line pointed north. That was the axis of eternity. Their tool for finding it was simple, a piece of wood shaped like a wide V. That was the Merkhet, an instrument of knowing. A sighting tool, a surveyor would hold it level, its two prongs forming a notch, and through that notch he would watch a single star. He would track its entire journey across the sky. He had a partner holding a plumb line, a string with a weight that gave them a vertical reference, a true line down to the earth. As the star rose, the observer would call out when it crossed the line of the plumb line seen through the notch. He would mark that point, then he would wait for hours as the star climbed and then began to fall. He would call out again when it crossed the plumb line on its way down. Now he had 2 points in the sky mirroring each other. The midpoint between them was the star's meridian transit, the highest point of its arc, and that point, by definition, lay on a perfect north-south line. True north, inscribed in the motion of the heavens. They often used the imperishable stars, the ones that never set, or they used Sirius, whose rising marked the flood of the Nile. This wasn't a quick measurement, it was a ritual of patience. It required a clear night, steady hands, and an understanding of stellar rhythms. It fused time and space. The hours it took for the star to move became the data that fixed a direction for millennia. Once they had that north-south line, the foundation was set. The entire temple complex, the pyramid's base, everything unfolded from that celestial truth. The Great Pyramid's near-perfect alignment shows this. Their genius wasn't in making complex gadgets. It was in using time itself as a measuring stick. They let the universe's own clock draw the first line on their blueprint. The Merkhet turned a night of stargazing into the permanent orientation of stone. It meant the pharaoh's house wasn't just aligned with the north. It was aligned with the turning point of the cosmos. Every sunrise that later lit its corridors was answering a call made in the dark by a priest watching a star slide through a wooden notch. The temple's north came from a star's path, but before any stone could be laid, that line in the sky had to be made physical. It had to be cut into the earth. For the builders of the Hagia Sophia and later the Suleimani Mosque, the real masterpiece was often hidden, dug deep below where the prayer hall would be. It was the foundation trench, not just a hole, a giant permanent template, a negative space that defined everything above it. They started with the most basic tools. Ropes and stakes, but the geometry wasn't simple. They began from the central axis, the Qibla line toward Mecca. From that sacred line, they used the 3-4-5 triangle or more advanced geometry to get perfect right angles. They marked the entire footprint of the mosque, not with chalk, by driving stakes into the soil at every critical point, every corner, every column, every wall intersection. Then the digging. Teams excavated along these marked lines, deep, narrow trenches that followed the exact layout. The sides had to be perfectly vertical. The bottoms level, often checked with long water channels. This trench was the first construction and the most critical. It locked in the precision. Any error here would magnify as the building rose. Walls out of plumb, domes under uneven stress. The trench was the unyielding baseline. Once it was perfect, they filled it. Not with loose earth, with a fluid mass of mortar and rubble stone. That mixture would set into a continuous ribbon of concrete, a rigid skeleton buried in the ground. So when the masons began building the walls on top, they weren't building on soil. They were building on a pre-made, perfectly aligned foundation. The trench had transferred the surveyor's lines from rope and stake into a permanent structural fact. It shows something. The greatest architectural marvels often depend on the most humble, unseen work. The soaring dome, the forest of columns, the vast space that inspires awe, all of it rests on the absolute certainty of those first lines cut into the dirt. The precision wasn't just for beauty, it was for survival. The Hagia Sophia's dome, rebuilt after collapse, stood for centuries because its load was distributed evenly down to that engineered base. The foundation trench turned a surveyor's diagram into a covenant with gravity. It whispered to the earth below to hold firm, so the heavens could be mirrored in the space above. The foundation trench fixed a building to the ground, but to fix yourself to the planet, to find your line north and south, you needed a different knot. One that tied you to the stars. For Arab sailors on the Indian Ocean, the question was latitude. How far are you from the equator? Their solution was the camel. Just a small rectangle of wood, a card with a string through its middle and knots in that string. Its genius was in its simplicity. The sailor would put one end of the string in his teeth on a specific knot. He'd hold his arm out straight so the string was tight. Then he'd slide the card along the string, back and forth, until the bottom of the wood seemed to touch the sea's horizon, and the top just met the North Star. When both the star and the horizon lined up with the card's edges, he had it. He'd feel the knot at his lips, or he'd tie a new one right there on the string. That knot now meant a specific latitude, a specific distance from the equator. Later, sailing again, he could find that same line by repeating the gesture, moving his ship until the card fit that same view. It was a physical memory of an angle, a star's height held in a length of cord. This tool, made for the open sea, then found a use on land. In the empty desert or the vast steppe where landmarks disappeared, the camel gave you a fixed point in the sky. A surveyor plotting a caravan road or a mapmaker marking a frontier could use it the same way. At a known place, a major oasis, a river ford, he'd measure the North Star's height with his camel. He'd tie the permanent knot for that spot. That location was now a waypoint defined by latitude. As he traveled, he could check his progress north or south by seeing if the star rode higher or lower against his card. With many measurements, he could set up a series of these celestial markers. This let you mentally grid the emptiness. You couldn't see lines on the ground, but you could know that two caravanserais sat on roughly the same parallel because the North Star stood at the same height above both. That informed trade routes, spacing resting places along steady east-west paths. It could help set borders in treaties, using the impartial measure of the sky instead of shifting rivers or hills. The camel made the idea of latitude into something a person could hold, verify in a moment, trust over 1,000 miles. It made global positioning something anyone could do. You didn't need an observatory. You needed a piece of wood, a string, a clear night, and the knowledge passed from one person to the next. In the exchange of the Islamic world, where things moved from Spain to India, the camel was a quiet constant. It offered a common language for location, written in the stars. It showed that the most sophisticated systems of measurement aren't about complexity. They're about reducing a cosmic truth to its simplest, most portable form. A truth you could keep in your pocket and read in the steady light of a single star. The camel tied a sailor to a single star, but the moon had a different story, a longer rhythm, and you can see it written in stone. On the coast of Brittany at Karnak, the land is covered with lines. Thousands of standing stones, not just a few. They are set in parallel rows that go on for miles across the hills, a whole grid of granite, silent, immense. For a long time, no one knew why they were there, what they were for, until the question changed. It stopped being about where they pointed. It became about when. And the answer is in the moon's movement. The sun, it swings between the same 2 points every year, the solstices, but the moon is more complicated. Its path along the horizon shifts. Over a cycle of 18.6 years, the spot where it rises and sets moves north, then south. Those farthest points are the lunar standstills. And at Karnak, the main alignments of the big stone rows, they don't point to the sun. They point to those lunar extremes. The builders laid down lines to catch the moon at its farthest wanderings. To do that, to set such straight lines over uneven ground, that was an engineering feat. They probably started with markers on the horizon, a hill, a notch between 2 peaks that lined up with a lunar extreme. From a central spot, they'd drive a line of tall stakes into the earth, sighting back at that horizon marker to keep the alignment true. Then, over generations, they replaced each wooden stake with a stone. A permanent one. The rows themselves became the instrument, the sighting tool. So to walk down one of those alleys is to walk down a corridor aimed at a celestial event. An event that only finishes once in a human generation. That changes what this place is. Karnak wasn't a temple, not in the usual way. It was a permanent lunar observatory. A calendar built right into the earth. Building it required a tradition of knowledge, one that was stable, carefully passed down. So a project a grandparent started, a grandchild could finish, all following the same precise astronomical plan. It tells you about a society that measured time in lifetimes and marked that time with monoliths. They made the whole landscape into a clock face for the moon. The slow tick of it measured by the silent progress of stones across a field. The precision here, it's not about inches, it's about patience, about watching the sky long enough to see its deepest patterns. And then having the collective will to carve those patterns into the land for everyone who came after. They measured the moon's path in stone, but a road or the edge of a field that was measured with a wheel. Just a cartwheel sometimes, or one made for the purpose. You'd roll it along the ground. The Romans had a cart, a hodometer that dropped a pebble every mile. But for a surveyor's daily work, the wheel was something else, a personal tool. You'd push it along a boundary, count the turns. One full revolution was a known distance, the wheel's circumference. That gave you the length, but then there was the last turn, the part that wasn't complete, the final few feet that didn't click over to a full count. That's where they wanted a finer answer. Long before the vernier scale had a name, the idea was forming in the field. Surveyors started adding marks to their wheels. Small notches on the rim or painted bands on the spokes. As the wheel turned, they'd watch these marks pass a fixed point on the axle. So instead of just counting whole turns, they could estimate a fraction of a turn. If the wheel had 8 marks and it stopped with the 5th mark just past the pointer, that was 5/8 of a revolution beyond the last full count. You could calculate that extra distance more accurately. It seems like a small thing, but the implications were deep. It moved measurement out of whole numbers and into the space between them. It acknowledged that reality isn't a neat integer. The truth of a distance is in the leftover bit, the fraction you have to estimate, and by creating a visual system for that fraction, they reduced the guesswork. A field's area became more reliable, the cost of road materials could be closer, the tax on a vineyard's perimeter a little fairer. This drive for finer granularity, for quantifying the in-between, it's a quiet engine. It's the mindset that would lead, centuries later, to the vernier scale measuring thousandths of an inch. But it didn't start in a scholar's workshop. It started in the mud on a road, a surveyor squinting at a mark on a wooden wheel, determined to capture every last bit of the truth. That incremental push for precision, the refusal to let the last little bit be lost to approximation. That might be the most enduring measurement. It measures our desire to understand the world, not just in broad strokes but in its detailed truth. The wheel's marks held a truth, and we forgot it. These 20 methods, they weren't just lost, they were erased, taken out of the story. Why would you leave behind something that worked, that was elegant? It's rarely one event, it's a slow drift. An empire collapses, that's a break. Roman roads go unused. The guilds of surveyors, the agrimensors, they scatter. Their tools, the Groma, the Chorobates, that knowledge was passed down, master to apprentice. It fragments, turns into local stories, and then the libraries. Alexandria, Baghdad, when they burn, the treatises vanish. The geometry of Hero of Alexandria, the plans for the Astrolabe, they're gone. These weren't public. They were secrets closely held. The rope stretchers in Egypt, the Qanat engineers in Persia, Polynesian navigators, their mastery was oral, a living craft. In the hands, in the chance, when the society that supported them falls apart, when a new culture comes in with its own systems, that chain snaps. The technique wasn't worse. Its guardians were gone. Then what we value shifts. The Renaissance, the Industrial Revolution, they brought a new idea of knowledge, standardized, printed. Mechanized, the theodolite, the steel tape measure, magnificent tools, but they came from a world that wanted uniformity, mass production. In that new light, the old methods looked like curiosities. Quaint, the idea that a knotted rope could match a machined ruler, or a sunstone could be as good as a compass, that was dismissed. The old techniques were solutions for a specific place. Born from a dialogue with a local environment, the desert, the jungle, the open ocean, the new tools promised one system for every landscape. We traded a deep, situated wisdom for a broad, portable power. And we told ourselves a story. That technology moves forward in a straight line, leaving the past behind as primitive, but modern archaeology has dismantled that. When researchers matched the lunar alignments at Karnak, or used a replica Merkhet to check the pyramid's orientation, they weren't just finding old tools. They were finding a different kind of intelligence, one that saw the environment not as an obstacle, but as a partner, offering references, the stillness of water. The path of a star, the bend of a swell, that forces a re-evaluation. Precision isn't a modern invention, it's a human constant. Those ancient surveyors got extreme accuracy. Not in spite of their simple tools, but because of a philosophy embedded in them. They sought harmony with cosmic patterns, earthly patterns. Their precision had a purpose. Social, spiritual, sacred. It had meaning beyond data. So this tapestry of 20 methods, it's more than a list of tricks. It's a testament to the diversity of human ingenuity. It shows there are many paths to the same truth, and it asks a question. In our age of satellite precision, what profound dialogues with the world have we forgotten how to hear? That last turn of the wheel, just a fraction of a revolution, it holds the whole journey, from the knotted ropes in Egypt to the star paths in Polynesia. These 20 ways of seeing, they show something, a universal human genius, measuring the world with observation, with ingenuity, with the simplest tools. These ancient surveyors weren't just technicians, they were philosophers, reading cosmic order into the land, artists, sculpting sacred geometry across mountains and deserts. Astronomers using the Earth as their observatory, they wove precision into civilization, not as an abstract goal. It was a vital act of meaning. Their legacy isn't in museums. It's all around us, the straight Roman roads that still guide highways, the property lines, the city grids we've inherited, systems from a Groma's cross. From a surveyor's chain, the ancient monuments that still awe us, their silent stones holding perfect alignments, to solstice sunrises, to lunar standstills. This journey through time, it reminds us precision is a timeless human pursuit. that quiet, persistent drive to understand our place, to bring order from chaos. To leave a mark that speaks across centuries, their tools seem humble, but the intelligence behind them wasn't.